A very good morning and warm welcome to the national webinar on literature in the times of COVID, organized by the Postgraduate and Research Department of English, St. Thomas College, Thrissur, in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of St. Thomas College Autonomous. This is the second session of this national webinar. And for this session, we have an amazing academic, Professor R. Swarnalata, serving as a professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. She started her career in IIT in 2010. And Professor Swarnalata is a recipient of a number of prestigious awards and fellowships, such as the Fulbright Predoctoral Fellowship to Harvard University in 1999-2000, Charles Wallace Fellowship to Cambridge University in 2013, Association of Studies in Literature and Environment Translation Award with Srijit Verma in 2015. And she is a winner of 2000 Thomas Wolfe International Student Essay Prize. And ma'am was selected for the fellowship grant by the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, for the research project Women Writing Nature in 2010. And IUC Fellowship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in between 2011 and 13. Professor Swarnalata is considered as an exponent of ecocriticism and related areas. She has published widely in areas related to ecological perspectives in literature. And she is a prolific writer with an amazing number of research publications and chapters in books. Almost all major collections and books in ecocriticism, ecology, and literature in India has contribution by Professor Swarnalata. She is also a renowned writer of fiction and published remarkably. Professor Swarnalata is a renowned speaker, editor, and researcher in a wide variety of areas. She's one of the pioneers of ecology-based approaches to literature and culture. Today, Narratives of Anthropocene mesh will definitely throw light upon philosophical concerns and research-based deliberations on radical naturalism and other areas of serious concern. I would like to welcome Professor Swarnalata again. Madam, over to you. Now.
Thank you so much, Professor Viju, for your kind words of introduction. A very good morning to everybody. It's an honor to be a part of this very significant webinar. It's all about ecology, literature, and I think today's topic, what the college is, foregrounding is how does literature respond to the pandemic. I think that's indeed a very, very significant topic. And as you might have seen from the brochure, I think the title of my lecture is rather long, Narrating the Anthropocene Mesh, the Ecocritical Imperative. So I'm trying to cover as much ground as possible in this allotted 1 hour or so. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to engaging with you. Well, it's commonplace to say that COVID-19 and its onslaught, continuing onslaught, I should say, has created a sober contemplation of the relational total field in which we are all enmeshed. Because the pandemic has brought to the forefront of our consciousness complex, interconnected issues of health equity, economic security, environmental justice, and collective trauma. So, literature written in such, I would call it strange times, should have an advocacy function, isn't it? So to begin with, I'm just going to talk about how we need to look at the word nature, because Raymond Williams says nature is perhaps the most complex word in the English dictionary, isn't it? And I'm going to begin with this all-time favorite Zen quote of mine. It's not my quote, but I think I own it because I have literally spent so much time thinking about its relevance. It's not my quote at all, sorry. And well, this quote is attributed to a 12th century Chinese Zen master, Qin Yuan, and he's defining a Satori moment, a moment of enlightenment. So this is what the quote says. Before I studied Zen for 30 years, I saw mountains as mountains, waters as waters. When I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point when I saw that mountains are not mountains and waters are not waters. But now that I've got its very substance, I am at rest. For it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and waters once again as waters. I mean, you know that in a Zen monastery, the education is very, very tough. If you don't get the right answer, you are beaten with a stick. So Qin Yuan's master perhaps asked him, are the three understandings one and the same, right? So I would say that this is a question which is very relevant for our troubled environmental times. The master passes through 3 stages of ecological enlightenment. In the beginning, he takes nature for granted. I saw mountains as mountains and waters as waters. And then he goes on to reduce nature to a mere construct of the mind, a sign within a signifying system. And in the end, realizing his folly, he enters into a larger enlightenment, which includes mountains and waters as well as minds. As a result of the environmental crisis, and for us it's the pandemic, to be more topical, we need a renegotiation of our civilization's relationship with reality. In fact, influential works like Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, this book talks about shifting paradigms relating to metaphors used to guide theory formations in science, right? So in fact, Kuhn is saying that we have to be very careful while talking about conceptual frameworks. Even science uses conceptual frameworks. Then do we need to say more about our own discipline? So let us briefly run through how various literary theories have defined their relationship to nature. Well, modernism believed that reasonable and it does not have any inherent value, but is ordered by natural laws. And once we understand and master these laws, we can master nature also. But postmodernism led us further away from the natural world because it began to treat nature as a mere social construction. So postmodernism believed that nature is neither personal nor orderly and all approaches to the natural world are relative, and that there is no value to life other than what we create. But what is an ecological approach? An ecological approach says that, or believes that, reality is personal and it is ordered, and this order is created by thousands of beings striving to create and realize themselves in multidimensional relationships. So, in other words, when we utter the word nature, we have to perhaps keep in mind. Am I audible? I'm so sorry to break the narrative. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Very much audible. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, to define nature, to go back to a definition of nature, we must understand nature as a psychophysical system which has an outer causal aspect governed by the laws of, causation, and an inner aspect which is capable of making a claim on our moral consideration, right? So we have to engage with this inner aspect at large, right? Because our cultural interpretation of reality, as well as any theories about reality, will be impoverished if we do not attend to this inner meaning. So we were talking about Kuhn and the paradigm shift. So maybe I can say that the paradigm shift is from parts to the whole. It is a shift from objects to relationship. It is a shift from, a limited anthropocentric thinking to contextual thinking. Explaining things in terms of their context means explaining them in terms of their environment. So the function of eco-criticism is to talk about the concept of the individual as engaging in a chronotopic relationship, or in other words, we are talking about the embeddedness of the self in any context of lived experience, be it social, economic, political, historical, and of course, environmental. So when we are doing this, we have to remember that the universe is a place, it's not a place, but it is an event. It's happening right now, right? It is not a noun, it is a verb. The present now, where we are forging so many relationships, right? So before I launch into the theory of my speech, let me break the tedium with a small incident from the Dhammapada. This is a beautiful story I read from Sukanta Chowdhury's The Metaphysics of the Text, right? So it recalls a story about Buddha and his disciple Ananda. So Ananda was teaching his students, and there was one student who was repeating a verse in Pali using a wrong pronunciation. So, I mean, in translation, this is what the student was saying. All depends on the heron in the water. So, where does the student go wrong? Instead of saying Udayavyayam in Pali means the beginning and the end of things. So he says Udakabakam. Udakabakam means heron in the water. Ananda is very, very incensed. He scolds the student. But the Buddha, who is watching all this, with a smile, he beckons the student and says, "Hey, don't worry about Ananda, your teacher. I think he's just gone senile. What you said was correct. All depends on the heron in the water." So the heron in the water is a very fitting image for what we need to contemplate on today. You know, the interconnected web of our existence. Because various schools of critical theory since the 1960s have been participating in the project of denaturalization of nature, right? The revision of which is one of the primary aims of eco-criticism. It has become almost obligatory to say there is no thing as nature, since nature has been reduced to a thing in a cultural discourse, a sign within the signifying system. So eco-philosopher Kate Soper, she protests against this. I quote from her. She says, in short, it is not language which has a hole in its ozone layer, but the real thing continues to be polluted and degraded even as we define our deconstructive insights at the level of the signifier. So the real thing is very difficult to define because remember Raymond Williams's famous quote, nature is perhaps the most complex word in the language. I'm also going to invoke journalist McKibben's work, The End of Nature, in which he talks about how nature, as we know it, has ended due to excessive modification of the earth by humans, which is a characteristic feature of the Anthropocene age. McKibben tells us we have changed the atmosphere, we are changing the weather. See, we grow viruses in our laboratories and they travel throughout the world. We have deprived nature of its independence, and that is fatal to its meaning. Nature's independence is in its meaning. Without it, there is nothing but us. Therefore, the end of nature is more than anything the end of an idea. It's not the death of nature, but it's the end of an idea. The idea of an independent, mysterious force that is beyond human control. So nature in this new paradigm is reduced to a problem that needs to be worked out through human intervention, right? And the title of my lecture is inspired by Timothy Morton's provocatively titled book, Ecology Without Nature. So in this, the first part of the title, the Anthropocene Mesh, I'll come to it in a short while. So Morton argues that the very idea of nature as a transcendental independent term, which informs most of our arts, ethics, philosophy, and ecological poetics, has now become obsolete with a heightened understanding of what truly constitutes ecological thinking. So the ecological thought does not refer to natural things alone. On the other hand, it denotes the interconnected mesh of everything that surrounds us, of which we are a part. So Morton concludes famously that in order to think in a truly ecological way, we must let go of nature. So the essence of these ideas is the idea of coexistence. That's what ecology really means. So in this paradigm, which is perhaps the reality, we coexist with human life forms, non-human life forms, non-life forms, the ecosystem, the biosphere, climate, planet, solar system. In fact, it is a multiple series of nested Russian dolls. Remember those little dolls which were available in the market? Children used to play with a couple of generations ago. So that's what reality is, right? So the ecological crisis makes us aware of how interdependent everything is. So who and where we are, because it's a very, very complex question, because we are also talking about ontology here. Who are we and where are we now? It's a complex question in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, to cut a long story short, is a term coined by Eugene Stormer in the 1980s, popularized by Paul Crutzen in the 2000s. It's a disputed term referring to the new epoch in which human actions have irreparably affected the planet. So we live in a world where the impact of humanity upon the Earth's natural processes and systems is becoming frightfully evident. Atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have recently passed the dreaded 400 parts per million, ppm threshold. They fell significantly during the lockdown, fell by 17 to 25%. Okay, so now it's gone up again, so you can guess. So biodiversity laws of the vanishing of species 100 times faster than without human interference points to the Earth's sixth mass extinction, which is the first caused by humans. So to quote Carl Jasper, we are entering a new epochal consciousness. So irrespective of the debates when this era started, when this geological era, the Anthropocene, started, did it start in 1492 when Columbus discovered what is today called the United States of America and created a European Holocaust? Did it start in 1784 with the invention of the steam engine, which ushered in the Industrial Revolution? Did it start with the explosion of the atomic bomb in 1945, and the great acceleration, the spread of industrialization in the world since then, the conclusion, regardless of all these debates, is that human history cannot be understood as separate from the history of the earth. So Bruno Latour has famously argued in his classic work, We've Never Been Modern, that modernity as a successful and rational framework of thinking has been challenged by the Anthropocene, or the intrusion of Gaia. Right? Gaia, from Lovelock's, the scientist James Lovelock's formulation of the Gaia theory. We'll talk about it a little later. But Gaia is the earth goddess who's supposed to have fashioned the entire earth from her own body. So one way of defining the Anthropocene is to look at it as an era of complex entanglements between nature or other than human forces and human action, right? An eco-critic, William Connolly, refers to it as entangled humanism. So in this new paradigm, nature is no longer the passive background, but an active protagonist. See, all of us are doing this webinar. I feel uncomfortable not seeing my audience. I feel uncomfortable talking to my laptop, So this isolation has been created by nature, a principal actor in the new paradigm. But what is interesting is that the dichotomy between agential man and passive nature has been fundamentally challenged. And the major insight that the Anthropocene offers is that of a larger state of selfhood. So it is not the narrow, bounded self, but it is a cultivation of interconnections. What Donna Haraway, the cultural eco-critic, calls. So this cultivation of this web of interconnections is perhaps an act of resistance against the threat of extinction, which invariably involves how we tell stories through and with other stories, right? So the importance of narratives. How do we tell stories? In fact, Donna Haraway is perhaps echoing a very ancient practice by Native Indian tribes. So in the oral tradition, when something terrible happened to a member of the community, it was woven into the story and everybody had to listen to it, right from small children to the most aged member of the clan. And it was kind of a participatory hearing and remembering so that it will be passed down, so that the lesson will not be forgotten. So that is what narratives do in our complex pandemic times. So the Anthropocene is a clarion call to new modes of knowing, new modes of engagement that are less human-centered or anthropocentric. So they are bound with an inescapable ethical demand. So it announces a need to inhabit this world in a spirit of mindful accountability, not just to those who are living now, but to all those multi-species generations who have come before and all who might yet still come after us. So finding new ways to respond to this planetary tragedy is a conceptual and representational challenge to humanistic scholarship. Amitabh Ghosh, in the great Derangement, observes that in a substantially altered world, readers and consumers of art will look for traces of these changes in literature and the arts. And any expectations of normalcy, balance, or order will tantamount to what Ghosh calls the great derangement. So the world in which we are living is witnessing a radical eclipse of nature. I'm using Frederick Jameson's phrase, in which even the timeless natural order cannot be taken for granted because nature has been relentlessly modified by man. So the environmental narratives that characterize our times have abandoned the pastoral, have abandoned the romantic return to an Eden or an Edenic myth of pastoral plenitude. or pristine wilderness, then these narratives turn increasingly towards a truly materialist vision that articulates dispossession, loss, disease, and a whole host of themes that characterize the dark thanatos of environmental pollution, toxicity, and slow violence. So, there are innumerable ways in which these narratives connect the personal and the political, the home and the world, the rural and the urban, human and the greater than human, human and the machine, the local and the global, the local and the planetary. So, narratives which help us to connect, narratives which give us a sense of this dialectical connection between two polar opposites, basically have what Alan Drenson, the eco-philosopher, calls free narrative spaces, right? So an important function of eco-criticism is the articulation of free narrative spaces that are more or less liberated from controlling stories. It's only in these open space visions that alternative tales of sustainability, earth democracy, and a whole host of issues can be given free expression. So these narratives are articulated in terms of systems that are open-ended and creative. So beat poet and bioregionalist Gary Snyder famously remarked, narratives are one sort of trace that we leave in the world, and all our literatures are leavings. So eco-criticism is a part of this gestalt. It's a part of this grand story-telling attempt. It can even be called a story of all things, which makes possible a literary appreciation and creation that is local and global, where there is no one dominant story. In today's culture, especially pandemic culture, I think we are all super saturated. We are inundated by facts. We are up to our necks in fragments of information. Do we take Covishield? Do we take Covaxin? In facts and figures. As a species inclined to care about individual cases and to be disinterested by vast processes and numerical descriptions, we struggle to understand big numbers, whether those numbers describe quantities of things or the kinds of vast processes, sudden cataclysms, or slow, barely perceptible systemic changes we are told are occurring in the natural world. So cultural critic Rob Nixon has a wonderful term to describe these processes. He calls it slow violence, right? So that leads us to the attendant question: what would a discourse of environmental sensitivity look like? So one of the particularly powerful meditations of quantification is Annie Dillard's 1999 book, For the Time Being. So Annie Dillard says, look, now there are 1 billion plus people alive in China, she writes. So she says, to get a feeling of what this means, simply take yourself in all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply it by 1 billion whatever. See? Who can perform such a simple act of multiplication? Simply do the math, says Annie Dillard. So numbers themselves are far from being the concrete form of reality, are a form of abstraction. They remove feeling from abstraction and leave us with data, right? This is due to fundamental shifts in consciousness that occurred during the 20th century, which are still now occurring. We once knew the world with our senses. It was determined using the brute realities of weather, of terrain, but the new reality is cut off from nature. For the real, we are substituting the virtual. So neurologist Robert Ornstein and population biologist Paul Ehrlich, they say it so beautifully in their book, New World, New Mind. I quote, "We don't perceive the world as it is because our nervous systems are evolved to select only a small extract of reality and to ignore the rest. Instead of conveying everything about the world, our nervous systems is impressed only by dramatic changes. We seem to need shocks and tragedies to goad us into action. So this again echoes Henry Thoreau's words. We need to be provoked, goaded like oxen as we are into a trot. So, how will we ever learn to think in a way that will enable us to adapt to the dangers of the modern and future planet? So, I'm not going to be talking about the contours of eco-criticism because I think the lecture in the afternoon will take care of that. But maybe I'll just give you a very, very broad bird's eye view. Since the 1960s, there has been an extraordinary surge of important North American writing about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And this body of literature is called nature writing or environmental writing. So, an important landmark in the history of eco-criticism is the foundation of ASLE, Association for Study of Literature and the Environment in the United States in 1992. So ASLE's influence spread globally. So you have a lot today. ASLE Korea, ASLE UK, Ireland, India, Canada, Taiwan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, Brazil, the European EASLCE. So the term eco-criticism was first used by William Ruckert in the essay Literature and Ecology, an experiment in eco-criticism, which came out in the year 1978. However, the roots of this theory lies deep in the past. So Scott Slovic, a foundational eco-critic, effectively sums this up. After more than 3 decades of doing this work, I still cannot pinpoint the Earth text of eco-criticism, Scott Slovic says. So William Howarth traces the etymology of the term eco-criticism from the Greek words oikos, which means household, and kritis means judge. So oikos is nature, our largest homestead, and kritis is the arbiter of taste who wants the house kept in good order, no booths or dishes strewn to ruin the original decor. I will still go back to 2 dichotomies which we can find in Greek thinking. Right? The Greek relegated women, children, slaves, and animals to the oikion or the oikos, which is the home space. And the politikon, which is the public, the outer space, was the realm dominated by men, action. So whenever we talk eco-criticism, we are talking about dismantling the master binary, the home and the world, the aham and the puram. You find that in ancient Sangam literature. Not to say that these binaries are wrong, but when one partner in the binary is devalued, that becomes problematic. We will discuss that later on. So it is customary to talk about the waves of eco-criticism. Some people use the rhizome metaphor, some people use the waves metaphor. So I will quickly run through the waves metaphor because it addresses the changing contours of this domain, right? So the first wave, it began in the 1980s. It defined nature as the natural environment. It focused on just British and American literature, and it argued for the protection and preservation of the natural environment against marauding humans. So we are talking about organizations as Earth First, like Earth First. We are talking about eco-terrorism. All these are traits of the first wave. So the second wave began in the 1990s. It moved away from very rigid definitions of nature writing to a more inclusive dialogue, which included urban landscapes in addition to wilderness, and rural landscapes, multicultural voices, multiple genres, and so on and so forth. The third wave, you can date it approximately from the year 2000. It is marked by the comparison tendencies across national and ethnic cultures. So you find an insurgence of a diversity of voices contributing to the understanding of the human relationship to the planet. So you have Caribbean writing, you have Global South writing, you have Latin American writing, so a diversity of voices. So eco-criticism of this period is marked by concepts such as eco-cosmopolitanism that reveals the dialectical tension between the local and the global sense of place. The fourth wave was defined by Scott Slovic in 2012 in his editor's note to the autumn issue of ISLE. So the focalization of the fourth wave is on the fundamental materiality of environmental things, places, processes, forces, and experiences. And this is very, very prophetic because the pandemic asks us to consider the materiality of everything, because we are no longer bounded individuals. Our boundaries have become porous. So we freely exchange viruses, touching surfaces. Animals pick up the virus. Because they are in contact with humans. So Slovic cites path-breaking works like Material Feminisms, edited by Stacey Alaimo and Susan Heckman, which emphasizes the inherent materiality of the human body and the natural world, and draws attention to how this retreat from materiality and its denial has had serious consequences for feminist theory and practice. Now, before I go on I'm going to give you examples of eco-critical practice. I think I still have about 20 minutes left of this lecture. I'm going to kind of foreground this part, the second part of my lecture, with a very important book by a scientist, Rachel Carson, who was working on pesticides in the 60s. She was working on how pesticides like dialdrin, aldrin, which were hailed as the wonder pesticides in the United States, were responsible for entire bird populations dropping off. So when she tried to present her research, I think she found a lot of opposition from the agro business industry. And therefore, she came up with a very new strategy. She borrowed from literature, the rhetoric of literature. So the title of her book, Silent Spring, it is from John Keats's La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. This is how it begins. Once upon a time in the heart of America, there lived a, so she just goes on about, the narrative paints a picture of pastoral plenitude, about horses barking in the countryside, silver fish, swimming merrily in the streams. And then she talks about a sudden blight that descends on the community. And she says they had done it to themselves. Now, what is interesting is this is the first example of consilient work, of the sciences borrowing the strategies of the humanities. What is rhetoric used for? Rhetoric is used to influence, to impress. The elections are around the corner. You see the use of rhetoric in a big time. So Rachel Carson employs two very ancient tropes of imagining the world. She begins with the pastoral and she ends with the apocalypse, the end of things. The Bible talks about the apocalypse. So you might want to ask me, what can an eco-critic do? Let me borrow this from the poet John Passmore. John Passmore gives us a question, or gives us a small challenge. He says, define a weed, W-E-E-D. And most of us will say a weed is a useless plant, or a weed is an unwanted plant. But in my campus, we clear precipice because that is supposed to tap groundwater. But in Rajasthan, precipice is revered because it is very drought resistant and it is used to feed the cattle, right? So precipice is a weed in Chennai. It is a bounteous plant in Rajasthan, right? So what is a weed? A weed is perhaps just the wrong plant in the wrong place, right? So getting rid of a weed is the problem for horticultural scientist, but defining a weed requires cultural analysis, right? And eco-criticism really talks about those issues relating to the environment, which lie half submerged in our cultural spaces, right? So that is the function of eco-criticism. So this part of my talk attempts to illustrate how narratives wield immense power in shaping even geographical imagination. Like, so I'm going to use the example of swarms that have represent the trope of wilderness from of writers from diverse backgrounds, from different periods of history. So I'm quickly going to look at writers like John Bunyan, Thoreau, and Sarah Joseph, whose works bring to light an evolving cultural commentary on the status of wetlands. And it powerfully articulates a wetland rhetoric. But let's now look at the science of wetlands. From a scientific point of view, I think wetlands offer incredible natural biodiversity. You can think of them as nature's kidneys. They help in long-term carbon storage, water cycles, and the moderating effects they can have on climate change is well researched. And their global habitats, you find them occurring in plains, you find them occurring in alpine ranges. And they're also transition areas where two distinct biological communities meet. They're called the biomes. So that's why these are referred to as ecotones. So cultural geographer William Howard draws attention to the hybrid and multivalent nature of wetlands, referring to them as waterlands, as some kind of a continuum between terra and aqua. So despite the vital role that wetlands have played in ecosystem dynamics, human beings have always been very, very nasty to wetlands. And today they are as endangered as the panda bear. So what are the reasons? Let's quickly go through them. See, wetlands are claustrophobic because they do not offer a sense of horizon. They do not offer grand views or vistas. And they force human beings to turn inward upon themselves, right? Today we are talking about pandemic anxiety because the pandemic has forced us to turn inward. So we don't like anything which does that to us. And wetlands constitute a perennial becoming. And therefore, you must think of them as a patient environment. So if you leave it undisturbed, it will transform muck into peat, coal, and other valuable substances. But at the cultural level, this slowness of process can inspire patience or desperation or alienation, whatever it is. And wetlands are transition zones between water and land. So they inspire divided values like difficulty or uncertainty, as in a quagmire or morass. And wetlands are anoxic, they produce methane, and we are oxygen lovers, so we don't like them, right? So, so if you look at the history of wetlands, I'm going to be very, very quick. I understand there are only 15 minutes more, perhaps. So, wetland drainage has constituted a major part of the eco disaster that followed the European colonization of America. See, at the time of European invasion in the 1600s, the United States, or what is today called the United States, lost nearly 85% of its wetland cover. Isn't that sad? Europeans found wetlands obnoxious, but the native Indians thrived in swamps. So they practiced subsistence farming, they grew their rice, they foraged, they hunted, they led a blissful life. So the marginalization of indigenous people and the draining of wetlands became parallel processes in the colonial missionary. So if you look at the vision of the agrarian nation, which presidents like Thomas Jefferson had in mind, the prime agenda was to convert a marshland into fertile agricultural land. And Crevecoeur, in his letters from an American farmer, for example, he talks about how the howling swamp is converted into a pleasant meadow, right? And similarly, William Bradford, we are all familiar with him, of his work, Plymouth Plantation, written between 1630 and 1651, roughly, which describes the early years of the foundation of the colonies. It talks about the New World and its original inhabitants as a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and men. So he compares the trials and tribulations in the New World with the 40 years of wandering in the desert wilderness of Sinai by the Hebrews. So these Puritans converted the command found in the book of Genesis for humans to have dominion over the earth into a moral imperative. So they did not bother about the earth stewardship, which Genesis actually talks about, forcefully talks about, but they only kind of thought they should have dominion over the landscape. So they modified the landscape, they killed the inhabitants. So the Great Swamp War fought in 1675 between King Philip's army of New England and the Narragansett tribe, killed thousands of men, women, and children. So John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, written in 1678, only 3 years after the Great Swamp War fought in New England, this book powerfully illustrates Puritan attitudes that objectify the natural world and reduce it to a set of symbols. All of us know Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory which talks about Christian fleeing the sinful city in search of the celestial city. So a Christian does not keep the straight and narrow path. He falls into the slough of despond, and which is described as a miry slough, a place which cannot be mended. So the instructor tells him it has swallowed up at least 20,000 cartloads, millions of wholesome instructions, right? But we are not able to set it right. So words associated with wetlands like bog, swamp, fen, mire, black water have claustrophobic undertones of entrapment, disease, death, and disorientation, and a whole range of derogatory meanings that reveal the human fear of interstitial geography. So in the significant book, Postmodern Wetlands, Rod Giblett talks about the need for a counter-tradition of swamp speak that can challenge rigid conceptual binaries and knowledge practices by emphasizing what Timothy Morton refers to as the mesh, the anamorphous rhizomatic networks we share with the non-human. So let us look at swamp speak in Thoreau's Walking. This essay, which became a part of Walden, was published in 1861. So Thoreau's Swamp Speak reimagines the stern monologue of Bunyan, who silenced the swamp and placed God's locus in the everlasting city, which is a spatial condensation of civitas or order. But Thoreau writes, when I would recreate myself, I seek the darkest wood, the thickest and most interminable. I enter a swamp as a sacred place, a sanctum sanctorum. This is the strength, the marrow of nature, right? To Thoreau, walking was a means of transcending the set patterns of everyday life, a metaphor for self-renewal. So his critique of the mechanical quality of city life, the emptiness of modern society, is evident when he admits that he finds the turmoil of civilization asphyxiating and prefers the clean, dry air of the swamps. So Thoreau's essay, I'm rushing because I realize I'm falling short of time. It offers a symbolic marriage of two images, the Garden of Eden, which is a ubiquitous pastoral trope of Western literature, and the dark, dismal swamp. So what emerges is an ecologically sensitive vision of a dark Eden. So when Thoreau speaks of the primitive forest that rots in the bowl of the swamp, he is drawing attention to the abundant biodiversity of swamps, which forms the bedrock of all civilizations. So the wetland ethic that emerges from this essay is the call for a deep recognition of this generosity. So civilized nations, Thoreau writes, like Greece, Rome, and England, have been sustained by the primitive forests, which anciently rotted where they stand. They survive as long as the soil is not exhausted. But alas for human culture, little is to be expected of a nation when the vegetable mold is exhausted. Now, I'll talk about water lessons from a global south perspective. So, I'm going to talk about the marshland in Sarah Joseph's Adi, translated by uh, uh, Devika as Malson Thampu as Gift in Green, which came out in the year 2011. The village of Adi in the novel Gift in Green is a place of primordial purity, a place dotted with water bodies, marshland, and slush. Right? So, Gift in Green actually articulates a deep environmental awareness which reflects the spirit of environmental justice movements in Kerala, such as the Silent Valley movement, the Plachimada protests against Coca Cola, the anti endosulfan struggle. Um, the Nelamirippa Samaram, just to cite a few. See, the novel is a lament for the diminishing water spaces of Kerala. So Kerala's rich wetland cover was 1/5 of the state, I believe, and that is rapidly diminishing now. And the Kabai wetland, which is the biggest of its kind in North Kerala, spreading over 1,200 square kilometers, is now under threat of pollution, landfilling, sand mining, development of tourism, wetland encroachment, so on and so forth. So, to go back to the story, the original inhabitants of Adi are the Pulaya Dalit community people, a despised and ill-treated people, says Sarah Joseph, who made a covenant with a small island. A covenant is a very sacred term. Remember, in the Bible, when you make a covenant with God, it cannot be broken. And if you break it, the land is punished, right? So the rainbow, which appears as a sign that God is pleased with the sacred covenant. I'm sure all of us know that. So they make a covenant with the small island which is brimming with sweet and clear waters. They are the ecosystem people, to use Guha and Gaddil's terms, who learn to grow rice in the salt waters of the marshland and subsist on the abundant fish and crabs. But somehow there is a cataclysmic change when Kumaran, an original inhabitant of the village, he goes back to the city, is corrupted by the ways of the city, and he comes back with concrete plans of material progress. So, Kumaran has struck a deal with the city's corporation to rid it of its waste. So this results in the unethical dumping of waste in the vicinity of Adi, which causes an all-round asphyxiation and choking of the marshlands. So it becomes a stagnant water world of all-pervasive muck in which there is a procession of the dead, the decomposing, the flycatchers, disease-breeding things arriving one after the others. So one of the storytellers of this community has a fund of stories about human beings, animals, snakes, and he tells us that there is water inside and outside stories of every kind. So when the sacred covenant with water is broken, the waters rise as an apocalyptic flood, purifying the toxic scape of Adi. So I'm going to just focus very briefly on chapter 16, which presents swamps speak through the language of myth and storytelling. There is a magician who lures the children with a cart of sweets. He empties the cart into the marsh, where the sweets continue to sink, alluring the grasp of the children's fingers. The magician asks the children whether they would prefer a playground in place of the marsh, where the sweets will not be lost in the miry slush. But the children consider the playground as a viable option, since they know that marshlands always bog things down. It's then that the magician tells them the story of the water goddess. She is the goddess of fish and rice. She dwells in a water mansion of astounding purity. If the marsh went dry, the water mansion would collapse and the goddess would go away, searching for wet marshes to inhabit. Her wrath would bring about a spate of droughts. The marsh would exhale poisonous gases. Trees and wildlife would be scorched by the heat, and people would have to leave the marsh forever. This is the lesson of the marsh. And the magician puts it succinctly. The marshes are meant to be wet and slushy, not dry and compact. There is a reason for this. Okay. So the marshlands of the fictional Adi offer a biocentric vision, right? Which is rather unusual for a global South narrative, because it is customary, whether we read Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, all these narratives depict how man and non-human are always pitted against one another in their struggle for survival. But Sarah Joseph Adi is not a utopia, but a society that understands interbeing. So she writes in her interview, or she says in her interview to Walsan Tambu, that in the scheme of things in Adi, human life is only as important as the life of the fish, the butterflies, the waterfall, the mangroves, the waterbeds, the sludge, and so on. So Sarah Joseph talks about her visit to a beautiful island called Valandakade in the Ernakulam district of Kerala, which inspired her to create Adi. The people of the village told her that they were earning 300 rupees a day from picking mussels. So when she tried asking them if they wanted to earn more, they refused, saying that they could count on the fish and mussels as fixed deposits because it would give them a daily wage. They did not feel the need to gather more. So the fictional Adi is an expression of this non-materialistic attitude of being in nature that refuses to instrumentalize nature for greed. So I've very briefly talked about texts which demonstrate the dangers of denying and also otherizing our sticky entanglements with our environments. So I would say that an eco-critical praxis facilitates a major shift in perception, a coming home to the realization that the world is your body. I'm borrowing philosopher Alan Watts' phrase. So I began with a Buddhist story. I'll also end with a Buddhist story. This is an image or it's a story, it's a Mahayana sutra story. It's called the Avatamsaka Sutra, which has found favor with quantum physicists as well. So the story speaks about how Indra, the king of gods, strung a wondrous net all around his palace. At every node of the net was a jewel representing a life form or a unit of consciousness, which reflects all the other jewels in the matrix. Since all these jewels are intrinsically connected, a slight change in one jewel is reflected in all the others and the entirety of space. So, although presented in mythic terms, the image reminds us of the myriad strands that constitute the web of life and the complex material and cultural circuits that crisscross the globe. So, eco-critical praxis is one of the myriad ways of honoring what the Buddhists call the Sangha, which is a great community of earth beings. And thank you so much for your patient hearing. I'll be happy to take questions.
Oh, thank you very much, ma'am, for your enlightening talk. The speaker's attempt has two sections, two parts. The first, she promptly introduced the concept of eco-criticism from gathering information from various sources. And in the second section, she was establishing the precise link between the question of ecology and this narrative form, literature and humanities. Finally, it was a long pursuit in search of what exactly is an eco-critical praxis. That was a question she was trying to address throughout her work, right from the beginning to the end. It was truly amazing in every sense because she has covered almost all major sections of the current debate on the question of eco-criticism and the challenge of the pandemic. Now we will have a small Q&A section. The first question is from Ma'am Rosmi Alex. Ma'am. She asked, can you just explain Donna Haraway's idea of the word worlding and how can you explain that, the idea of worlding?
Thank you so much, Rosmi, for that interesting question. So, see, I'm interested in what Haraway calls a becoming with. So, whirling, I think, I think the term is uh, more frequently used in post-colonial theory. But when Haraway uses the word worlding, I think it has a very specific resonance. So this becoming wit is um, this multiple engagements, this what do you call it? For lack of a better word, I'll use the word interbeing. I'm sorry to kind of mix philosophy and cultural theory, but I think the best way to understand worlding is to perhaps think about a little story which this Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, he was nominated for the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize. Very often he would, teach his sermons in a very, very simple way. Like he will just hold up this for his audience and say, what do you see? What do you see? And I don't think there's time, so I'm going to give you the most popular answers to this question. People will say, well, it's a sheet of paper, it's space, it's white, but Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the Harawayan becoming with. He says, can you see the tree from which the paper was made? Can you see the man who cut the tree? Can you see the cloud, the rain which fed the tree? Can you see the man who carried the log to the timber mill? So the series of interconnections. So that is worlding. So nothing exists by itself, right? So we are all connected. So I think the pandemic has, told us that very, very forcefully. In a way, it has obliterated. Yes, there are problems of health equity. Yes, I can go to a private hospital and get the vaccine much before. All those problems exist, but at a deeper, conceptual level, I think we understand that dichotomies don't hold good any longer. So that's how I understand worlding. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from about Thylacine and Anthropocene of Donna Haraway.
Sorry?
Thylacine and Anthropocene of Donna Haraway. How useful enough these two terms to define our present pandemic situation?
Okay, I'm not going to talk about Thylacine or Anthropocene. Anthropocene was a convenient tag word because to me it made sense because we have to de-anthropocize. That's to me what would be a better word is the Symbiocene, right? Because there are so many scenes which are now coming up, right? Today we talk about new emotions like solactic existential distress we feel in the face of the pandemic or changed environmental condition. There are so many scenes, but let us focus on the symbiosis. To me, that is the most viable model. We cooperate because we understand that we are all one at a very basic material level. And as Homo sapiens, we also reflect on it. We are self-reflexive individuals. So at a conceptual and philosophical level, we are able to think of multiple interactions. I'll again illustrate Symbiocene with a small story from Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was no environmental writer, but his stories are so wise. It's the ending of a story called The Artist. So the story goes when Narcissus dies, everything in the world of nature mourns for him. The flowers mourn for him, the valley mourns for him, the trees mourn for him. But the pool of water into which he would gaze all day and pine away, that does not cry. And so the flowers get angry and they ask the pool, why is it that you don't mourn? And he was such a handsome man, this Narcissus, and he used to look at you all the time. So, and I believe the pond or the little lake responds, say, "Oh, was he handsome?" Because whenever he bent down to look at me, I beheld my own beauty reflected in his eyes. So, I mean, this is metaphor speaking, right? But it also tells us the multiple interactions which are happening, right? So, the Symbiocene is more than the Thulocene or perhaps even the Anthropocene. I endorse the Symbiocene. Thank you for your question.
There is another question from a participant, Dinesh. This is about Dinesh Wardwell's opinion
I think there's a
that
question
human.
on ecological imperialism. Sorry, I think Karunya has. Can we take that, Professor Biju,
Yeah,
first?
sure, definitely, of course.
So, Karunya had a question on ecological imperialism. Um, so, let me also pop another scene word. So, when we look at plantationocene, there's a lot of critical writing on that now. Or if you read Amitav Ghosh's words, you will realize that when the colonizer came, uh, they attempt to recreate their terrain, isn't it? They wanted to. So all our hill stations are fashioned on, the Britishers' concept of home. So home also meant flora, fauna. So you have eucalyptus trees, which perhaps don't belong to the local, or you have monoculture, which wipes out the biodiversity of the region, or you have tribal people losing out on their traditional lands because, I mean, they never bothered about enclosures, right? The idea of owning land was totally alien to them. So they were criminalized by the British colonial laws, and when we speak about the tragedy of the commons, it's about the city gradually encroaching into the forest, taking away everything which belonged to the original dweller, right? So Mailama's struggle, I mean, it's also it's a kind of resistance to a colonizing activity, right? Um, See, it was a typical David and Goliath kind of struggle, but all she was worried about is my children are falling sick. The water in my well has turned poisonous, and that's why she fought, although she did not have the wherewithal. So whether we are talking about, neoliberal policies, corporate capitalism, whatever it is, anything which takes away the rights, or anything which takes away the integrity of the land. Aldo Leopold, writing in the 30s, spoke about land ethics, right? Because before that, nobody had thought of granting ethics to land. Today, Australia is such an enlightened country that water bodies are given rights. Certain endangered species are given rights, and humans can argue on their behalf. So look at how I changed as a result of moving away from um, you know colonialist practices which smack of violence. Yes. So I hope that answered your question. Yes. Sorry, Professor
Yes.
Bijoy, there's another
Yeah,
question.
yeah, no problem. Yeah. Ma'am, there is another question from the participant. This is based on Dinesh Wardwell's book, War Against Animals. And
Sorry,
he opines that human hostility to. Can you hear me?
not a little. Can
Yeah,
you repeat it?
this is based on the book by Dinesh Wardwell's War Against Animals. He opines that human hostility to animals is largely applicable to nature.
Thank you for that question because today there's so much on. When we talk about animal rights, when we talk about eco-criticism, which environmental justice narratives which uphold animal rights. We are also talking about the originary point where this, imperfect perception occurred. right? So all of us who have studied English literature or studied history, we are well acquainted with concepts like the great chain of being, So in the great chain of being, I mean, there's a specific place accorded to each species. So, I mean, humans definitely supersede animals, the four-legged ones, um, or the so-called insensate things like mountains, right? Um, I'm tempted to invoke Gary Snyder's powerful piece, the Mountains and Waters Sutra. So Gary Snyder, this was a translation of Dogen's great writing. Gary Snyder has this very significant line. He says, "Blue mountains are always walking. And if you do not understand the mountains walking, then you do not understand your own walking. Blue mountains are always walking." Now, this seems like a koan. It is not. Because if you look deeply into blue mountains are always walking, you might wonder, I mean, how can a mountain walk? But you realize as a mountain walks, even if you look at the ecology, a mountain breaks, it becomes, it disintegrates, carried by streams into rivers, rivers reaching seas, going back, this entire cycle. Blue mountains are always walking. And um, since we are so limited in our perception, Snyder would say, well, human beings look at water as water, but fishes may regard it as a palace, right? So the ability to otherize or to think, put yourself in the in other shoes, has been lost to us because we've been conditioned to believe that we are at the center of the universe. I'm tempted to kind of quote another eco-philosopher who says, if we disappear off the face of the universe, nothing is going to affect the earth. But the bacteria which lives in our armpits, if they disappear, that would be a loss. I forget the name of this eco-philosopher, but that is the statement. So, Descartes thought that, Descartes, Aristotle, the whole lot of them thought that animals were like, hands of a clock. You twist them, they don't feel pain. There is a whole legacy of torture, of how we have marginalized them. Thanks for this relevant question. So I would see it as a result of the master binary. Anything is the man versus the other. So this binary contains the master-slave relationships in class, caste, gender, non-human world, everything, right? But we have to look at the larger perspective. I forgot to mention Lovelock's great contribution to our understanding of our place in the universe. So James Lovelock was this NASA scientist who was working on Mars. And during the course of his investigations, he realized that the Earth should have been a lot warmer than it is now. And despite global warming and all that, it should have been a lot more warmer. And then he realized that the Earth's lithosphere, cryosphere, biosphere, and the various other, rocks and the other non-human things which we take for granted, they were behaving as a single, feedback organism to regulate temperature and therefore life on Earth, right? So it was almost as though the Earth was alive. This is what Lovelock said. And so when he discussed with his best friend, William Golding, what to call his theory, Golding said, why don't you call it the Gaia theory, after Gaia, the Earth goddess? So you realize that, I mean, for life on Earth to flourish, so many things which are greater than us are flourishing. So that is why it is greater than human, not animal. We must call it greater than human. Yes, thank you.
Ma'am, there is one more question left.
I
Can
think
you share
we've done this, Professor. Yeah, I
Okay.
think I addressed.
Yes. We have just finished that question. So I believe the questions from the participants are almost over. Um, and this is, of course, a great pleasure, a privilege to have you here, ma'am,
It's my pleasure, sir.
because because
A number of our
you know.
students have been associated with your college, and it's a very happy occasion for me to be here today, at least virtually.
Oh, thank you very much, ma'am. And most of Swarnalata's writing, Professor Swarnalata's writing, are not simply merely academic, but they are all immensely passionate about the present crisis and explorations of ecology. And most of the writings have some sort of a transdisciplinary kind of rigor, rather than the academic kind of routine work. So that's why she has passionately embarked on a lot of writing about ecological consciousness, ecocritical practice, and so on. On behalf of the college, of St. Thomas College, and the organizers, may I register my immense sense of gratitude regarding this lecture, and hope all collaborate in future in similar sorts of projects. And the postgraduate and research department of English, and the coordinator, Sri M.A. Biju, and the head of the Department of English, Dr. Anna Thomas. Their presence is mercurial, pivotal in shaping up this sort of an immensely significant national webinar in this context. And our next session is at 2 p.m. Today afternoon by Dr. S. Susan Deborah. Her topic is Positions and Readings in Ecocriticism. And thank you for all the participants and the faculty, and including Ms. Christina, the technical staff, and others who materialized the whole project. Thank you for all. I'm again, grateful to you, ma'am, Swarnalata ma'am, for your time and effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.